seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 9106, the Enhanced Presidential Security Act of 2024, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 9106, a bill to direct the Director of the United States Secret Service to apply the same standards for determining the number of agents required to protect presidents, vice presidents, and major presidential and vice presidential candidates, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 9106.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield as much time as he may consume to my friend, the congressman from the great state of New York, who is the sponsor of this critical legislation.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. In America, elections are determined at the ballot box, not by an assassin's bullet. In recent months, we have seen 2 such attempts on the life of former President Donald Trump. First, in Pennsylvania, and most recently in Florida. That these incidents were allowed to occur is a stain on our country. We have endured through assassinations of political leaders, including presidents. It is destructive to our country. It is destructive to our democracy, our constitutional republic. And it undermines the confidence that Americans have in their government and in the electoral process. But for a millimeter's difference, Donald Trump would be dead. But for a millimeter's difference, an assassin would have upended our election. Regardless of how every American feels, regardless of how every American intends to vote, it is the right of the American people to determine the outcome of this election. The idea that our election could be decided by an assassin's bullet should shake the conscience of our nation, and it requires swift action by the federal government. It requires Congress to ensure that the Secret Service provides the same level of protection as it does to the President of the United States, to the leading candidates for president. And in this case, former President Trump and Vice President Harris. Either one of them is going to be president come January 20th, 2025. And the American people should get to make that choice. I want to thank my colleague from New York, Congressman Richie Torres. We immediately moved to introduce this legislation in the aftermath of the first assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And it is shocking that it took a second assassination attempt for Donald Trump to get the same level of protective detail from the Secret Service as the President of the United States. It shouldn't have come to that, which is all the more reason why this bill is necessary, to ensure that this never happens again, and that the Secret Service conduct an immediate review to determine what resources are needed, what personnel is needed, and report immediately back to Congress to ensure that every candidate running for president gets the same level of protective detail as the current president, and that the same level of protective detail afforded to the vice president is afforded to the vice presidential candidate. We have a responsibility to ensure their safety and their well-being. And I want to also commend my colleagues, Congressman Mike Kelly and Jason Crow, who are leading the House task force on the attempted assassination of President Trump. Their work to investigate this incident and the detailed shortcomings within the Secret Service will certainly help Congress implement further meaningful reforms in the future and to ensure the funding and resources are available. I think the most important thing for the American people to understand is that it is the responsibility of the government to ensure that our elections are free, are fair, and are decided by the American people at the ballot box. And that any attempt, either by a foreign government or by a fellow citizen, to undermine that by trying to assassinate a political candidate must be stopped at all cost. And so I thank Speaker Johnson, I thank Leader Scalise, I thank Chairman Jordan for swiftly moving to advance this legislation to the floor for a vote. And I encourage every single one of my colleagues, regardless of their political views, regardless of whether they like or dislike one of the candidates, to recognize the fundamental fact that we have a responsibility to ensure their safety and well-being and let the American people decide who will be president, not an assassin and not an assassin's bullet. And with that, I reserve.
Yeah. Yields back. We
yield back
reserve, Mr. Speaker. Well done, Mike.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 9106, the Enhanced Presidential Security Act of 2024, requires the Secret Service to apply the same standards for determining the number of agents required to protect presidents, vice presidents, and major presidential and vice presidential candidates. It also directs the Secret Service to conduct a review of the provision of protection provided to these individuals and to report its findings and recommendations to Congress. I support this legislation to ensure that the Secret Service has the tools, resources, and procedures necessary to keep our highest elected officials and candidates safe, which is critical to our democratic system of government. But in advancing this legislation, Republicans are hoping to distract from the common denominator in every successful assassination of a U.S. president, as well as the attempted assassination of President Reagan and the attempted assassination of former presidents and presidential candidates Theodore Roosevelt and Donald Trump. In every single one of these events, the weapon used was a gun. The fact is that the work of the Secret Service is made infinitely more difficult by our lax gun laws. But this Congress, the Republican majority, has repeatedly sought to further weaken our gun laws, endangering our children, our law enforcement officers, our communities, and even their own presidential candidate. Last year, after a mass shooter killed 6 people, including 3 children, at a school in Nashville, Republicans fought to make sure everyone could continue to acquire the accessory that shooter used in circumvention of the National Firearms Act. Earlier this year, our Republican colleagues cheered as the Supreme Court, stacked with Republican nominees, struck down the regulation of bump stocks, allowing the accessory used in the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history to again be available to the public without even a background check. When the Senate tried to bring up legislation to again regulate bump stocks, Senate Republicans blocked it. Similar legislation in the House has just one Republican co-sponsor, and the Republican majority has refused to advance it. Just today, Republicans used their control of the Judiciary Committee to advance a bill that would weaken the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, reinvigorate the black market for guns, and reopen the online and private sale loophole. That legislation would make it so that convicted felons, domestic abusers, and other dangerous persons who are prohibited from possessing a gun could easily get one without a background check. And it would make it so that unlicensed sellers could once again profit from endangering our communities. And it doesn't stop there. Not only have they sought to unravel our gun laws through legislation and our courts, but our Republican colleagues have also sought to defund the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the primary agency tasked with enforcing our gun laws, including by helping state and local law enforcement solve violent crimes and keep guns out of the wrong hands. The cumulative effect of these efforts is clear. We know from headline after headline that it is far too easy for violent individuals to get a gun and then to life, or many lives, in a matter of seconds. That is true whether the attacker targets school children, a domestic partner, a house of worship, or a presidential candidate. The challenges faced by the Secret Service would be vastly diminished if we passed any one of our many proposals to keep guns out of the wrong hands. But over and over, Republicans have prioritized access to deadly weapons over the safety of our communities. I support this legislation because the Secret Service must be able to protect our highest elected officials and candidates. But this legislation will do nothing to make the rest of us any safer or change the fact that gun violence continues to take the lives of more than 100 Americans every single day. As Republicans yet again rush headlong towards a government shutdown, unable even to manage the most basic aspects of governing, and as they continue to oppose every action to prevent gun violence, Democrats will continue to fight to make our communities safer for every American. I nonetheless urge my colleagues to support this modest legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
So let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. Some crazy guy on the left tries to assassinate President Trump, and it's Republicans' fault? That's what we just heard. Next thing they're going to say is, oh, some crazy guy on the left tries to assassinate President Trump, and it's President Trump's fault. Oh, wait a minute. They said that too. This is ridiculous. We have a bipartisan bill that Representative Lawler went to Democrats, worked with them on something that everyone knows needs to happen. And what does the ranking member do? Says it's Republicans' fault. And what do Democrats do? What did the left do? They say it's President Trump's fault. You cannot make this stuff up. After all that President Trump's been through, they go to that. After they spied on his campaign, after Mueller, after impeachment, after they raided his home, after they tried the crazy 14th Amendment idea. Best way to beat him is not let him play the game, not let him go on the ballot. Thank goodness for the Supreme Court, which decided 9-0 that was bogus. That's what they do? I wasn't even going to talk. I was going to let Mr. Lawler, who's done the work on this, handle all this, and his remarks were totally bipartisan, not partisan at all. We were just going to let this good piece of legislation that's going to go on suspension, everyone's going to vote for, just let it happen. But no, they cannot help themselves. It's ridiculous. I yield to the gentleman from New York who is working in the proper fashion on a good piece of legislation that will protect both, as he indicated in his opening remarks, both former President Trump and Vice President Harris. That's what we want in America. I yield as much time as the gentleman may consume.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is recognized.
On the issue of gun violence in America, I think about New York and the disastrous cashless bail law that was put into effect and supported by the ranking member and continues to be supported by the ranking member, in which more than 80% of perps who are carrying and using a gun are released back out onto the street. I want to quote New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Quote, "When it comes to guns, this year, 2,386 people were arrested with a gun. Of those, approximately 1,921 are out on the street," end quote. Eric Adams went on to say, quote, "Arrested with a gun, out on the street. Gun arrests in custody, 19.5%. Out of custody, over 80%. Quote, how do you take a gun law seriously when the overwhelming numbers are back on the streets after carrying a gun? End quote. Eric Adams says very clearly, you can't take it seriously when you refuse to prosecute people who use guns in the commission of a crime. So many of my colleagues in New York have been so clueless about this. They talk about gun violence, but they have no problem allowing a criminal using guns in the commission of a crime to be put back on the street to do it again and again and again. It is wrong. So if you want to crack down on gun violence in America, then prosecute criminals who use guns in the commission of a crime. But no, we don't want to do that. New York raised the age, 16 and 17-year-olds being treated in family court rather than criminal court, and the gangs are using them, letting them use guns in the commission of a crime because they know they're going to get a slap on the wrist. So let's get serious about gun violence in America, yes. Let's crack down on criminals who actually use guns in the commission of a crime. I yield back to the chairman.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New York yields back to the gentleman from Ohio. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this nation is awash in guns. It is the only nation where we have time after time after time school shootings, where we aren't even surprised at mass shooting events in schools. We're the only nation that has mass shooting events because of our lax gun laws, because we are awash in guns. And Mr. Lawler says we should prosecute people who use guns in crimes. I agree, we certainly should. We certainly should do that. And if the people in New York aren't, they should. And I can't comment on the New York laws. I haven't been in the legislature in 32 years. Mr. Lawler's been there more recently. But the fact of the matter is, this country is awash in guns. And Mr. Jordan says that a left-winger attempted to assassinate former President Trump. We don't know that. The person who attempted to assassinate him, we know, researched the whereabouts of former President Trump. He researched the whereabouts of of President Biden. He seemed to want to kill somebody. And I think, and the evidence seems to point out that the reason he attacked Trump and not Biden was because Trump was holding a rally near where he was. But the fact is he's dead, and we don't know. We certainly don't know his political opinions. But in any event, this country is awash in guns. And while this amendment is a good amendment, or this bill rather is a good bill, we should equally protect our presidential candidates, whether they're the incumbent president or the would-be president and vice presidential candidates. The fact is that presidential candidates and all of us are less safe because this country is awash in guns. And there's the only country in the world, I shouldn't say that, there are countries where genocide is being committed, like Darfur and Sudan, but it's one of the only countries in the world awash in guns as the way it is. I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, the co-sponsor of this bill.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to partner with my colleague, the gentleman from New York, Representative Lawler, on a matter of urgent importance to our nation. The United States is entering an age of ever-escalating political violence, as evidenced by the violent assault on the United States Capitol on January 6th, and as evidenced by not one but two attempted assassinations of a former president. On July 13th, the difference between an attempted assassination and a completed assassination was not the skill of the Secret Service, it was luck. If the gunman had been slightly more precise in his shooting, or if the former president had moved ever so slightly to his right, the former president would have been killed. The fact that America stood inches and seconds away from a national crisis is itself a crisis. The security of a major presidential candidate, whether it be the Democratic nominee, Vice President Harris, or the Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump, cannot be left to chance. Hoping for the best or lucking out is not a policy prescription for protecting a president or a presidential candidate. Both the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, should be dedicated to a bipartisan, bicameral proposition that both major presidential candidates of both parties are entitled to the highest level of Secret Service protection, not only for their sake, but for our nation's. One final point, the Secret Service urgently needs not only more resources, but also deeper structural reforms. Only 30% of the Secret Service budget is dedicated to protective operations. The remaining 70% are spent on legacy functions that trace back to the Secret Service's time in the Treasury Department. The role the Secret Service plays in financial law enforcement does not reflect a rational allocation of resources and responsibilities. It is an accident of history, a relic of the past that should be re-examined by the United States Congress. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, yields back to Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from New York is prepared to close. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the federal government is, just as it was this same time last year, on the brink of shutting down, threatening to cut off essential services for millions of Americans. Instead of addressing the real needs of the American people, Republicans have spent this week spreading misinformation about immigrants, attempting to hide from their own record on reproductive care, and evading their responsibility to govern. In bringing up this legislation, they seek to distract the American people from the fact that their own actions have repeatedly made every American, from presidential candidates to school children, more at risk of gun violence. When Democrats take back the House, we will work to make everyone in this nation safer. But for today, I urge members to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge a yes vote on this common sense, good legislation that is designed to protect our presidential candidates, and would yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 9106 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Speaker, we'd ask for yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed.